Hello, and welcome back. I'm very excited for this panel now today, this discussion we're going to have here. We have Jennifer, we have Shelley, and we have Jeremy here. I'm very excited. On the right-hand side, don't forget you've got the chat feature. I see you jumping in there already. You've got the Q&A tab. Do please use it. Pop those relevant questions in there. Upvote them. We love to see them. Down the bottom, I see you've already got the emojis going. So I'm going to quickly bring up Jennifer here. I'm going to ask you what the talk title is today and what you guys are here to discuss.
All right. Thank you so much for that intro, Nikki. So today's panel is called Web3 to the Moon. So we are talking about Web3 and space. It is super exciting to me because I think we always talk about these technologies as it pertains to Earth, but there is this whole other space, pardon the pun, out there that we don't often get to talk about, and we have two amazing experts with us today. So joining us for the discussion is Shelley Peterson and Jeremy Frank. I'm going to let the two of you introduce yourselves because I really don't think I can do you justice. So Shelley, let's start with you. Why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are and where you come from?
Sure. I'm Shelley Peterson. I'm an associate fellow for Lockheed Martin with a focus on augmented and mixed reality. I help the teams integrate augmented and mixed reality for the production of spacecraft. And then in my spare time, I'm also on the Technology Advisory Council for the Barbara Bush Foundation, working with adult literacy.
Awesome. And Jeremy?
So my name is Jeremy Frank. I work at NASA Ames Research Center in California, in Sunnyvale. I'm a computer scientist by training. I study artificial intelligence. For about the last 10 years, maybe a little bit longer, I've worked almost exclusively working in the area of human spaceflight. We build a variety of tools to help operate space missions. We're also building some tools to help space missions become autonomous. And that means both making the crew smart by giving them crew decision support tools, and also making the vehicle smart, turn the vehicle into a sort of giant robot that helps the crew out by doing things so the crew and mission control don't have to.
Awesome. And just so people know who I am, my name is Jennifer Sanasie. I am a journalist. I host a show every day on CoinDesk where we discuss the latest in fintech, blockchain, and crypto. And I'm the co-founder of a startup that is looking at how NFTs can help creators monetize their content. So that's the three of us. Let's get right into it. This whole entire conference is on Web3. We're talking Web3 and space, but something that has become very prevalent to me throughout the conference and throughout the last few months is that Web3 has many different definitions. So, Jeremy, I'm just going to start with you. Let's just give maybe a broad definition to what Web3 is as it pertains to the conversation we're about to have.
Well, so for the most part, Web3, as people think about it, probably doesn't have a lot of applications in space on board spacecraft, right? Most spacecraft, especially on the software end, is about the things that are sort of running all the way down in the guts. But it's probably not common knowledge that Web 2.0, web browsers, are actually used on board spacecraft and have been for quite a long time. The International Space Station has it has a computer network much like the ones that we're all using today, and the crew have access to web browsers that they can use in order to do a lot of the kinds of things that we do, looking at data, looking at plans and schedules in particular. And that was actually pretty exciting to me to find out. So there's applications of things like Web 3.0 in the space.
How many times are we going to say space? Okay, that's great. So I think before we get started, I said it in the intro, I'm really excited to talk about space because we don't often get to talk about it. And I think it's because the majority of us never really get to see space. We don't get into the nitty-gritty. It's only a handful of people that really kind of work in the space. And it's been 30 years since we've had a man on the moon. Shelley, why is it so important for us to continue the conversation about innovation and space exploration?
It's I think the root of our nature. We want to explore the next step and the next step. And in doing so, we create technologies that are used broadly. I mean, for example, the work that I work with, we use the technology to build spacecraft. But then we found that we could use the same technology to help with adult literacy. And that spans so broadly across these technologies. The things that we learn and the advances that we make help us in so many ways that span beyond spacecraft. But then there's also the nature of what we're doing with space. If you have a smartphone, you're using a product from space, most likely. If you're navigating anywhere, you're using GPS data. We put satellites and spacecraft up that analyze asteroids and pull material to bring back down to Earth for us to analyze. And we find that we need to put a spacecraft up to nudge that asteroid Bennu off course so that it doesn't come too close to Earth. There's many different reasons why our space explorations are very important, but it spans within space and beyond it.
Jeremy, why is it important for you to continue the conversation around space?
Some years ago, so like I said, I mostly work in human spaceflight, right? And in human spaceflight, we think Johnson Space Center, Mission Control, Apollo, walking on the moon. But space is so much broader than that. If you look to robotic spacecraft, these are things like, say, the James Webb Space Telescope, vehicles that went to Pluto, and if we think about, our most crowning achievement technically, which is the Voyagers, which have gone beyond what we consider to be the solar system boundary for the first time. And many, many years ago, I was at a meeting and I was talking to some of our colleagues in robotic spaceflight, and they were sort of, pounding on human spaceflight, which gets the bulk of the money. And it occurred to me that, as humans who go to explore, exploration's in our genes, it's in our blood, it's things that we do, we sort of can't help ourselves. But more than that, we need our human and robotic heroes. And our robots are heroes, right? Look at the way that people have latched onto Ingenuity, the Mars helicopter. It's a hero. It's a hero to everybody who has seen it fly on another planet for the first time. So that's how I think a lot of us in the space biz think about space. It's a frontier that we cannot help but try and explore.
Shelley, you mentioned several technologies and innovations that we use in our everyday life that I think a lot of people don't realize have their foundation in space. Can you tell us a little bit more about the technologies that you've worked on that have transitioned to just everyday technology that we use right here on Earth? And you can even touch a little bit more on your literacy project if you'd like.
Sure. So I believe it was back in 2011 when I started looking at augmented reality in the space industry for Lockheed. And then around 2017, we were using mixed reality devices like the Microsoft HoloLens on the shop floor building spacecraft. Now, what we found was that we could save significant touch labor and provide value to the programs. A significant, what would take 8 hours, some of our groups were finishing in 45 minutes with a 90+% reduction in touch labor. In over 4 years that we've used this device out on the shop floor, we haven't had any errors occur while it was in use. But what it does is you put on the device and you see 3D objects in your environment. When we realized that we could do that, we realized we could take the work instructions and animate them on top of the actual structure. So instead of looking at a 2D drawing, either on paper or on a 2D screen, and then having to make that mental translation to how it applied to the 3D structure in the room, you have that instruction overlaid on the actual physical structure, and it removes the need to interpret, which reduces risk. It makes the instruction very clear so that you know without a doubt what your next step is. We can also use it to determine where to place objects like strain gauges and heaters and thermistors, components like that. As we progress and have a connected version of that technology, our teams can collaborate in that space as well, which reduces the need for travel. We have subject matter experts across the country and across the world, and they help with many different programs. And wouldn't it be nice if they could support without having to travel to be on location, but with the rich tools that mixed reality brings? So that's another area where we're really excited to see how the technology is progressing. The devices have eye trackers in them. You can give them voice commands, you can give them gestures. It can even gauge how your eyes are moving. And what we noticed with adult literacy is that when you think of how you take a literacy test, you're usually reading a paragraph and then answering a couple of questions or writing a paper. It's the same thing that we've done for decades, more than a century, really. And so we thought, what would happen if we could take those eye trackers and measure each eye independently and really gauge what's going on as we read. What we found is some people bounce across the top of words, some people read through the words, some people focus in front of the page, some are at the page or behind the page. We find that some people circle back on words. We have a question that we're trying to answer right now to see if we can use those trends in eye movement to detect barriers to reading earlier, things like dyslexia or ADHD. They say you read to learn up to the third grade, you learn to read up to the third grade and then read to learn from the third grade on. So by the third grade, if you don't have a strong handle on your reading skill, it can impact so many other things that you're trying to learn. So, just an example of how we're using what we're finding in manufacturing spacecraft with advanced technology to hopefully help in many other ways and advance the technology in those areas as well.
That all sounds just really cool, honestly, for lack of a better term. So cool. Jeremy, you mentioned robotics, and I want to talk about how we can take what we've learned from robotics in space. Like, how can we apply that here when we look at AI and robotics to further innovation here on Earth?
Right. So robotics is a pretty broad field. A lot of people think of a robot as sort of a thing with wheels that drives around in an environment. There are plenty of robotic spacecraft that are similar to that. So Mars Perseverance, which carries the Ingenuity helicopter, is a wheeled robot that's driving around on Mars. It's not the first one. We are hoping to send wheeled robots back to the moon. But we also talk about robotic spacecraft as free flyers. So a robotic spacecraft could, for instance, be orbiting the Earth and taking pictures and using that for science. We have robotic spacecraft that orbit the moon and take pictures of the moon to use that for science. Same with Mars. Robotic cameras fly by Pluto and so on and so forth. So a lot of different kind of robots with a lot of different technologies. Early in the space age, those robots really were the creme de la creme of robotics. Now terrestrial robots are the creme de la creme of robotics. And we field so many more robots on Earth that we actually learn from them in order to build our space-based robots. So the information flow really goes both ways in terms of technology development. But when you think about what a robot in space needs to do that a robot on Earth really doesn't need to do, it's very, very cold in space when the sun is not shining on your robot, which doesn't happen so much on Earth. But it's also very hot in space when the sun is shining on your robot, which many people forget. And so your robots need to be thermally controlled in ways that terrestrial robots typically don't. So that's a real problem. As robots get further and further away from Earth, your power generation and your energy is going to come primarily from batteries because the sun is now too far away. And so you can't rely on the sun to provide power generation. So if you look, for instance, at Perseverance and Curiosity, the two big Mars robots, those two robots don't use solar panels in order to generate power. They have batteries, and they also have radiothermal generators to provide both power and heat. And so there are places on Earth that are very extreme. Think deep ocean, think cave environments. And so it's those extreme robots that I think are going to be the big beneficiary of things that we do in space in terms of robotics.
Yeah, when I think about space, I feel like there's three pillars, and you guys can correct me if I'm wrong. We have the people, we have the craft, and then we have control. That's mission control. I want to talk through each one of those and talk about what's pushing the edge when it comes to innovation as we go into 2022. So let's start with the people. And Jeremy, I'm going to start with you. How are we innovating when it comes to sending people to space? Or are we even focusing on sending people to space? Are we more focusing on robotics now?
Right. So for those who are not aware of it, there's a big international push to send people back to the moon by roughly 2024. It's led by NASA, the United States. It's called the Artemis program. The Artemis program has been ongoing for quite a long time. There's a lot of information about Artemis on the web, and it has a number of different tenets to it. But first and foremost among them is getting people back on the surface of the moon in a sustainable way in preparation for someday sending people to Mars. So again, the first lunar missions are slated with people on them for about 2024. Lunar landings maybe 2026, 28. And then that's sort of the stepping stone to Mars. So humanity definitely wants to return to the moon and to continue to have a presence in space. The material that's out there to talk about getting people back to the moon is much more compelling than anything that I could say. I'll take some time while Shelley responds to the next question, and I'll find something on Artemis and stick it into the chat for people to take the question.
Okay, awesome. Shelley, did you want to talk about people, or did you want? I feel like craft is more your forte. So you tell me.
Either one, whichever you prefer.
Okay, let's start with people then.
So, I think it's inspiring and exciting, the thought of sending people to the moon or to Mars. The explorations in deep space, there's things that we can tell from robots, but having a person there to actively make decisions and help provide some of the insight from what is being found, I think, is what is also very exciting to most people. It's the adventure of it, and then the results that you find from having someone there. A robot may not pick up on. But I also think that having robotics there can be very helpful, especially in situations that, might be a little bit more dangerous that we don't want to put humans into, or in areas where we need to primarily capture telemetry and data, and robots can serve that purpose.
If I can add to that just a little bit, there's a nice anecdote that comes from Steve Squires, who is the principal investigator of the Mars Spirit and Opportunity rovers, which are quite dated now. But he liked to tell stories about how slowly those robots were able to travel, how little distance they covered, how a human geologist could do in 15 to 20 minutes what it took a Mars rover decades, or years, or many, many years to do. But we can't send people to Mars yet.
Right.
We haven't sent people to the moon for 30 years. So this gets back to we need our human and robotic heroes, and we need our human and robotic explorers, and they complement each other. We want to use robots as pathfinders. We want to use them as scouts. And we want to gather information to send people to the best possible place, because we can't send people nearly as easily, expensive though it is, to send robots.
Isn't it fantastic to have that data so much earlier so that we can learn more rapid pace, engineer more rapidly? It really is synergistic.
Yeah, it's funny. We talked about how people haven't been to the moon in 30 years. Then we talk about this goal of getting humans back there by 2024. What are some of the challenges that we still need to overcome in the next 2 years to achieve that goal?
This is a good question. So if you look at robotic spacecraft and compare them to spacecraft that have people on them, the biggest differentiator is the fact that you have what some of my NASA colleagues like to call the pink squishy stuff. In other words, you have an astronaut, a human astronaut, and the human astronaut needs to be kept alive. So not only do they need to be kept alive, but they also need to be kept comfortable, right? They need to be comfortable enough to actually do the work that we send them up there to do. And so that means that a human supportable spacecraft must have a life support system. So we take all of that really for granted when we live on Earth, but life support is all manner of different things. It's keeping you from being too cold. It's keeping you from being too hot. It's making sure that the air that you breathe is sufficiently healthy. It's making sure that you recycle the human waste. And turns out recycling human waste is a really big deal. You can't really just store and get rid of it, especially on a long mission, because otherwise you'd need to carry way too much, and it would be too much to carry. And so doing things like recycling the air and recycling the water are really the biggest differentiators between robotic spaceflight and human spaceflight. We have solutions to most of those problems, but they're big, they're bulky, and they're very expensive. And so there's a giant amount of time and energy that's being spent on that part of the problem. We don't just want, in the Artemis program, we don't want to just go and sort of land and raise the flag and come back home again. We want to go and learn how to stay and to live. And that is a profoundly different way of doing business than what we did in Apollo in the 60s. In order to do that, we need to conquer problems like the life support problem. We need to conquer problems like efficient power generation and distribution. We need to, the thing that I spend most of my time thinking about, we need to make the crew more autonomous. We need to make them have more and more control and ability to make the good decisions in order to do whatever it is they need to do in order to stay healthy and to survive. And that's where the moon is the proving ground for Mars. So the challenges are, well, profound. There are a lot of them just to get to the moon.
I mean, imagine flying back through the atmosphere and reaching temperatures that are half the temperature of the surface of the sun. But you need to keep the inside of the spacecraft at 70-something degrees. That's an example of one of the challenges.
Yeah, profound is a great way to put it, Jeremy. The challenges are definitely profound, but the innovation that's happening in the space is extraordinary. Let's move on to craft now, Shelley. We've spoken about the people. Let's talk about the spacecraft. What's at the cutting edge of spacecraft as we head into the next year?
Well, as Jeremy mentioned, there's so many challenges that we see in space that we don't have to deal with when we're designing vehicles for Earth. All the different environments that you have to be able to deal with. There's a question of whether we use mixed reality in those environments to help astronauts access information. We are using it to build the spacecraft and possibly to train in different areas. It shows a fantastic potential for training. But can we use it to access information more quickly? There's a time element when we need to access information for maintenance and sustainment or for other types of challenges that they may see in space. And then for us, the question is, can we add value? Can we reduce risk? Can we improve quality? When you think of the triangle of faster, better, cheaper, the assumption is that you can usually hit two of the three. You can go faster and better, but it's at the cost, But with mixed reality, we've seen that we can hit all three. We can perform manufacturing activities more quickly. We can reduce the risk and improve quality, and we can do it at lower cost. So that's one of the things that we're working on, is how do we enable that technology more broadly across the life cycle of the production process for a spacecraft.
I don't think I've ever heard someone say they've hit all three, Shelley.
Right? That's what makes the technology so exciting in so many different environments, is that if you can hit all three, now there's something that we can latch on to there.
Yeah, Jeremy, I saw you put your hand up. Did you have something to add?
In my experience, you can hit one of the three.
Right.
You got to team up with Shelley.
Well, so Shelley's talking about the use of augmented mixed realities in the manufacturing domain, and she alluded to the idea that you'd like to see if it can be used in the operational domain as well. And so there are two places where something like augmented reality could be used by either mission control or the crew. So one of them is that you have, say, suited crew inside the spacecraft, and there's a lot of inspection and maintenance activities that astronauts need to do in order to make sure the spacecraft is healthy and happy, because not all the information that mission control needs is available to them. They get a lot of data, but if you need to put eyeballs on something, or if someone needs to look at a mechanical system, that's something that right now the astronauts need to do. And so that's a place where, let's say that the promise that is seen in the manufacturing floor hasn't met the reality of how we put this augmented reality technology in space yet. But that's one of two places where potentially we can get some big wins. The other is when the astronauts have to go outside their spacecraft. So when they go outside, this is called an extravehicular activity, or an EVA. And right now, the astronauts in an EVA suit have very limited information available to them. A lot of information gets sent from the suits back to either the spacecraft or to mission control. But wouldn't it be nice if more information was available in sort of a heads-up AR display to the suited crew? And so there have been a number of different demonstrations in analog environments in order to test and evaluate technology like that. There are some activities NASA's engaged in to try and figure out how to build sort of a heads-up display to give the astronauts the kind of information that they need. It may not be the kind of thing that you see with, very sophisticated and detailed overlays, but it's using the same kinds of ideas in order to give the crew more useful information so that when they're out there, they can make the right decisions and do the job and stay safe.
I think we kind of covered mission control as we were covering the craft. But Shelley, I have to ask you, in preparations for this panel, you said that some of your inspiration comes from Hollywood films, Iron Man specifically. You have to please unpack that for me.
So many of us have seen Iron Man and Minority Report, and we see those mixed reality environments. Jarvis, which actually is an acronym. We love our acronyms. Jarvis is just another rather very intelligent system. So, when we put a device on a technician for the first time, I can't tell you how many times, it's hundreds, we've heard them say, I feel like Iron Man, because they have the data pop up and they can give gestures and control the data. It's not just viewing the data, but it's interacting with it and capturing information from them. And so I had the opportunity to meet Ian Dawson, he was a executive producer for Iron Man and helped with those Jarvis scenes. And so we got to brainstorm a bit about what user interface looks like. And, I reach back to him quite often to talk through different topics and concepts and to get his thoughts on what things could look like. There's also an Infinity Festival where they take, the concept is they take Hollywood and they take Silicon Valley and they cram them together and see what happens. And it's really interesting because you have the creativity of, Hollywood, you have technical expertise from the Silicon Valley type companies, and they're not all just from Silicon Valley, they're broad, but that's the concept. And it's fun to see what happens when you take people who dream up the concepts and the people who build the capability and put them in the same room. Which with Spacecraft, that's also what we do with the technicians. We like to reach out to the technicians. We have an idea of how they would use the technology. We show them our thoughts, and then we want feedback. We want to hear how they think it can be used to help them. And they're not shy. They give us some really good ideas. And that's primarily where we use the technology today, is the areas that they visualize. And then with the user interface that, is also influenced by Hollywood.
Jeremy, have you been influenced by Hollywood at all?
It's in my work. No, I think not really. Although we can't talk about this without talking about Andy Weir's The Martian, which was both a magnificent book and also an equally magnificent movie. But the inspiration certainly goes both ways. It I think gets back to why we explore. We explore because we look up and we don't know what's out there, right? And so that I think is common to both Hollywood and to the space biz, is this dream that it's sort of a place to go and look and see what you find. I want to take a riff on what Shelley was saying about getting user feedback. So we do much the same thing, both in our tools for mission control and also tools for the astronaut corps. And there's a discipline called human factors engineering, which is super important to trying to elicit that feedback from users who you're showing something for the first time. And you may not know what they want of it and out of it, and they may not know what it can do for them. And there's this group, that the technical group that bridges the technology generation people and the users are these human factors engineers. These are the people who can figure out how to ask the users who are using this the right questions to get to the bottom of what it is that's working for them, what's not working for them, and the best ways that they can use some of this new technology. And so it's a pleasure working with those people, because it's them who are really bringing the story home to the end users, right? And making it the best tool it can be for them.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. I mean, I think we would have found throughout most of this conference, user experience, as it pertains to Web3 or any emerging technology, is really what makes the technology useful. And it's interesting to hear that it still pertains here, because I think when we think about space exploration, we think that these are the most highly technical, highly educated people out there, and yet still user experience, that feedback loop, is still so important. So that's very interesting to hear.
It really is, because you can have the most talented, well-trained person, but if you give them a poorly built tool, they can't use it. And if you give them a poorly built tool and ask them to do a critical job, they're going to let you know that that was not the right tool for the job, and give me a better tool.
Yeah, that's important. That feedback loop is so important. I want to talk about the government versus the private sector when we talk about space, right? I think we're seeing more and more private companies, a lot of startups that are working with both the government and larger private sector companies joining the race to space. And so I want to just set the stage. Maybe, Jeremy, you can help us think about, how do we think about the relationship between the government and the private sector when it comes to space exploration?
Right. So full disclosure, I'm a NASA civil servant, so I work for the government and I'm here to help. Really. But so within the United States anyway, the government is not allowed to compete with private industry, right? So there are no government-sponsored industries. And that's not true everywhere in the world. Europe is different. Other parts of the world are quite different. So at least for us, we have in-house NASA engineers who build a few things, but for the most part, we purchase goods and services from the private sector. So if you go all the way back, even to the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo era, who built those vehicles, right? Northrop Grumman built parts of those vehicles. Boeing, Lockheed, Marietta before them, Northrop Grumman, Rockwell. And subcontractor after subcontractor provided components for all of those spacecraft. So this idea that government and private industry are sort of at odds is I think, far from the truth. And having said that, though, I think in the current era, especially in human spaceflight, what you're seeing is a huge shift in who's doing what in terms of responsibility. So previously, what would happen is that NASA would ask, say, Boeing, I want you to build me a part of a spacecraft, and I needed to do this and this and this and this and this. But then government would mostly operate. So not all flight controllers are civil servants or work for NASA, but many of them are. Now that's changing. And SpaceX operates the Falcon vehicles and the Crew Dragon and the Cargo Dragon vehicles until they dock to the International Space Station. That's the kind of big shift that we're seeing in human spaceflight in particular. And because you have companies like that, among many, many, many others in the new space business, it is now possible for private industry to sell the same services that they're selling to the government to many other people. So that, I think, is the huge shift that we have seen over, say, the last 10 plus years in the relationship between government, state-sponsored space exploration, if you like, versus private and corporate state-sponsored space exploration.
From your perspective, Shelley, do you have anything to add?
It's a team effort, right? So when you look at different space products and different space missions, there's an element of NASA involved, and large companies and small companies. And when you look at the number of small businesses we work with just within Lockheed, I mean, it's in the thousands. So, I see it as a team effort and synergistic across the group. There's times where we compete. There's also many areas where we team up.
So now that,
sorry, go ahead.
no, you go ahead.
The other big difference I think that you see is in why people want to go to space, right? And government wants to go for some reasons, companies want to go for different reasons. It's sort of obvious, but there's another. This is a bit, well, no, I'll say it anyway. So within the science part of NASA, we talked a little bit about robotic explorers that circle the Earth and take pictures of things for scientific purposes. Well, it's now getting to the point where you can have cameras that are capable of taking pictures of the Earth from geostationary orbit, which is 30,000+ kilometers away, and that these images are of scientific utility, which is just completely incredible if you think about it. But it's very, very expensive to build, launch, and maintain a geostationary satellite. And so another example of the interesting public-private partnerships that within NASA people are thinking about is to interact with the commercial communications satellite industry, who build and manage lots of geostationary satellites, and ask them, hey, listen, can we hang a science instrument off your geostationary ComSat? And so the first of these public-private partnerships is called TEMPO, which is an atmospheric monitoring mission, and more are to come. So that's yet another place where people can be very innovative in how private industry and government cooperate in order to do things that are great for everybody.
I think this is the perfect segue into talking a little bit about regulation. And it's so funny. I brought this up this morning as I was preparing for this talk. And one of my colleagues said, but how do you regulate space? So I was reading a story this morning. It had to do with SpaceX and a chunk of a spacecraft that's floating around in space. It's set to hit the moon, I think, in March. In the story, there are experts who are saying, while this is not an impactful event now, it could be an impactful event as there's more traffic in space. And so that we should start thinking about regulating the space environment now. Is it too early to start thinking about regulation in space? Shelley, I'll pass it off to you first.
I think the answer would be no. Space debris is already a bit of a challenge. We need the regulations in place to minimize space debris, as an example. If we have space debris that causes a collision, okay, now we lose capability and it creates additional space debris. That's just one example where regulation is a good thing so that we can protect the capabilities that we have there and make sure that in the future, when we're putting capabilities up, that they can function. But there's many areas where regulation, I think, is warranted and is a very positive thing.
Jeremy?
Right. So space debris actually is one of the things that's been regulated already in space. Communication frequencies are already regulated by the FAA, and that extends into space already. So the third place where there is regulation that already exists in international agreements is in the area of nuclear technology in space. So you recall that we talked about the fact that, the further away you get, the more you want to rely on something other than solar panels. So radiothermal generators are very, very handy for this because they provide low levels of energy, but also heating on your spacecraft. But the ability to use nuclear technology in space is limited by nuclear non-proliferation treaties. So it is most certainly not too early to regulate space. Space already is regulated in a variety of ways. And I am not a favor of regulation one way or another, but I think that examples like this are just the kinds of reasons why regulation continues to be something that we have to all talk about.
Yeah, I think especially when we talk about Web3 and other instances, it's like Web3 versus the regulators. And so I thought it would be like an interesting, it would be interesting to look at how regulation is unfolding in space. Is there further regulation to come as you said, as we look to put humans back on the moon by 2024 and we look to do more in space?
Well, so here's where I have to say, I'm not a NASA lawyer. I'm not a lawyer at all. So I don't really know what's coming. But the kinds of things, what's regulation for, right? It's as Shelley pointed out, especially with space debris, it's there to keep people from getting in each other's way. It's there to keep people safe. So I think the more crowded space becomes, the more crowded, say, the frequencies become, the more rocket launches there are. I think that you can't help but assume that something will come in this space.
Shelley, did you have anything to add?
Well, it's regulation can provide opportunity.
Mhm.
So, for example, with debris, making sure that there's a process that's followed allows the opportunity for small companies, large companies, countries to all participate. So while it is regulated, it can have the effect of opening up opportunity.
At the beginning of this talk, we took a stab at defining Web3 for the purpose of our conversation. And I didn't say what I think of Web3. When I think about Web3, I think about decentralization. And I think that's a word that a lot of people associate with Web3 as we all collectively try to define it. Jeremy, talk to me about decentralization versus centralization when we're talking about exploring space.
Yeah, so this actually is a big deal, and it's a big technical deal, and it's primarily in the robotics world that it's a big deal. So I'll focus on that to the exclusion of human spaceflight for a minute. So, Earth observing is actually an excellent way to talk about this. So if I have a single large satellite with a lot of instruments on it, and they're all pointed in the same direction, then I can collect a lot of information from the Earth in a lot of different ways. But a giant satellite is expensive to build. So perhaps large numbers of satellites is better in some way. Large numbers of satellites give me better coverage of the Earth. I can have satellites with many different instruments on them and collect different information. But now I have this coordination problem. And the centralized versus decentralized debate immediately comes into the fore. How do we decide? And if we look at the ways that satellite missions, especially Earth-observing satellite missions, are run today, they tend to be run in a centralized way, mostly because people don't have good ways of thinking about how to do things in a decentralized way. The technology development parts of NASA are thinking hard about how to build decentralized robotic space missions. There are two in particular. Actually, there are three in particular, and I'll say what they are very, very briefly, and people can talk more about them a little bit later. So one of them is, imagine that I have multiple spacecraft that are flying close together, and they have radios and they can communicate with each other, but they're free flyers. How can they act together in order to do a job, like, say, taking pictures of the Earth in a coordinated way? You can have exactly the same. There's a similar mission that's for robotic rovers that are intended to go to the moon. And then last, and this one is the most interesting and most technically challenging of all, what if I have a decentralized team of robots that are building lunar infrastructure, like lunar antennas, lunar power distribution systems? And so while Shelley's responding, I will drop links into the chat for each of those three projects, and people can go investigate a little more about them later.
Jeremy, you're so efficient. I love this. I see you interacting in the chat and adding information for our audience there, and that's great. Shelley, tell me how you're thinking about decentralization.
Oh, I'm just looking forward to reading Jeremy's article, because I can just imagine a team of robots building structures on the moon. It's something I'm intrigued by and always want to learn more on. But I can imagine the technical aspect of that and the situational awareness of the robots and I start going down the technical path, sorry.
Yeah, no, that's okay. So I was going to try and get away in this whole panel without my glasses, but I have to put them on because we have a question from the audience. So here we go. All right. So our audience wants to know, could Web3 and blockchain technology improve data transfers from the moon or far distant satellites?
I'm going to lean on Jeremy for this.
That's probably a Jeremy question, I was going to say, but he's busy. He's busy researching.
I'm almost ready.
I can see blockchain and the security that comes with blockchain could benefit possibly, but I know that it can benefit in the logistics and the manufacturing side.
So the short answer is I don't know. But let me say one or two things about spacecraft and their difficulties that may make blockchain difficult. So spacecraft computers tend to be 5, 6 generations behind what's in your pocket on your phone, let alone what's on your desktop. Why is that? The market for sending computers to space is very limited, which means people are pouring giant amounts of investment into what goes into your pocket, and they're not pouring quite as much investment into what goes into space. The space environment is very difficult from the standpoint of temperature, also radiation. Deep space is much worse than low Earth orbit, but there's still a lot of radiation in low Earth orbit, and the list goes on. So what does this mean? It means that computers are much less powerful, they have much less memory, and they're much more fragile, and the software support for them is much smaller. So let's just think about blockchain from the standpoint of no deletion, okay? So if I have to record every single transaction and I'm not allowed to delete it, then I already can immediately see that I may have a memory problem. Where am I going to put all this data? If I'm never allowed to delete anything, that could be an issue. The more data that I have, the more computationally intensive database retrieval is. All that database retrieval means that it's going to be slower on a slow processor and it's going to be more energy intensive. So if I think about all the benefits that blockchain potentially offers me as the underpinnings of Web 3.0, I have to ask myself, are those use cases the space use cases? Am I getting the benefits that come with all the associated costs? We already have a lot of trouble, squeezing everything that we want into our flight processors. So those are some of the issues that someone wanting to use blockchain in space to enable anything, right? Whether it's distributed communication, whether it's direct-to-Earth transmission increases and efficiencies, those are some of the things you're going to have to worry about.
Yeah, I've seen a few blockchain companies pop up looking at fractionalized ownership of space assets and different use cases that they're trying to prove out. But Shelley, maybe let's go back to blockchain for manufacturing. You mentioned that just before Jeremy started speaking. Have you explored that extensively?
No. I mean, my role is augmented and mixed reality. So, but I know that there is an interest in the logistics and supply chain element using blockchain.
On the blockchain topic, I think you can't escape Web3 these days without talking about the metaverse. It's just on the tip of everyone's tongue. Everyone is jumping into the metaverse. And so I thought it would be a fun way to end our panel. When we think about the metaverse, is there an opportunity here when it comes to space education and getting the information out? Like we've talked a lot about what's going on in space, but I don't know that really trickles down to the masses, especially when it comes to education. Is there an opportunity here using the metaverse to show people what's out there in space?
I think there is. One of the applications of AR that that we haven't talked about yet is in mission control itself. So the Jet Propulsion Lab has a tool called OnSight, which was developed as part of their InSight lander, which is not a mobile vehicle, it's a lander. But what they've done is they've taken all the camera imagery from the InSight lander and they've essentially created an AR environment for the scientists who want to plan the next mission activity to do. Right? So the innovation is basically to have a scientist be able to say, that rock looks really interesting. I want to drill a hole there. That's what it's for. But there's no particular reason why that technology could not be used as part of education. There's a very, very different, what's it called? I think it's called the ISS experience. So these people flew a whole bunch of basically spherical cameras up to the International Space Station to take pervasive imagery throughout the entire inside of the ISS. And I think this now is an in-theater experience. So this is kind of joining technology for mission ops and education and experience and entertainment. But yes, I think there's absolutely a lot of interesting directions that all of this could go.
Shelley, I was gonna toss it to you, so take it away.
An example, when my nephew was 3, I put a HoloLens on him and I had planets. And at 3, he looked and he said, "Red, and he started running around the planets. I had them on about shoulder level for him. it's kind of funny. He was running through the planets and he was going, it doesn't hurt. So I think he was learning some physics observations there. But he was inspired by it. And every time I would see him, he'd say, do you have the glasses? Do you have the glasses? I want to see this, see space. And it created an energy. But I've taught at high school in the past. And I can just imagine how you could use mixed reality, augmented reality, virtual reality, metaverse type capabilities, especially in a collaborative environment, to teach concepts much more quickly and to create that energy and curiosity that, we still have, but I think that you can take it to the next level. And then as learning tools, you can use space products to, say we want to explore the weather. You could see some really interesting things in a mixed reality type view and layer data to access information much more quickly than you can through other methods. I think there's going to be interesting ways to explore that. Really what I think that we're seeing with the metaverse right now is we're at the stage where some of our attendees may be too young to remember, but when we were at wireless phone, not smartphone, but wireless phone, there was a question of how beneficial is a wireless phone going to be? I can go over to the wall and pick it up and answer it. But then you start to add capabilities and more capabilities, and look where we are today. I think that with our access to information through these new channels that the metaverse is offering, we have ideas of how we'll use it right now. But that's going to morph and change significantly over the next couple of years, and it'll just grow more from there.
It's funny you bring up your nephew and just like hearing his experience and like running around and having this headset on. Do you think there's a gap when it comes to space education? I mean, I think about when I was in school and it was a very narrow part of education. And this discussion has made me feel like not only is the technology advancing space, but it's going to advance our understanding of space. And so, Shelley, I just would love to get your thoughts on that.
The work that Jeremy is doing is fantastic. And with all this additional information that's coming across, I think it gives the opportunity to, present so much more data along the educational path in so many different ways. As we learn more, it gives more opportunity to explore it on different levels. Mm-hmm. So yes, I think that it's becoming much more of interest in so many different areas. We'll just continue to grow as we learn more about space. But I love being in the conversations with y'all and with Jeremy, because I learn something new every time we're in a conversation, and I can't wait to go read his articles because I know I'm going to learn something there.
Jeremy, what are your thoughts? Is there a gap to fill when it comes to education around space?
Gosh, well, yes, but I was, this was a couple of years ago. I happened to be taking my kids to, a class somewhere, and I happened to hear, someone else in the line who was another kid attending the class sort of complaining about how much money was being spent on space at the expense of other things. And being the loudmouth that I am, I turned to him and I said, well, look, I work at NASA, and I'm not telling you that you're wrong, but there's a lot of good that the investments in space have brought us. The value proposition for things like space and for things like going back to the moon are very, very hard to quantify. But even though I've worked in human spaceflight a very, very long time, the part of NASA that I find the most compelling and the most interesting is the Earth science part of the Science Mission Directorate. The idea that we can put satellites in space that inform us of the Earth that we live on, our home, and the things that we are now able to do that we could not do even 10 years ago. The idea that we can put a geostationary bird 35,000 kilometers away and get 1 kilometer pixel resolution of the Earth 24 hours a day, 7 days a week is going to blow the doors off of Earth science. So if there was an education gap that needed to be filled, I'm passionate about human spaceflight. I'm passionate about robotics, but the potential of that kind of investment in space to help us protect our Earth. If I had to pick and choose, I would say focus on that to the exclusion of all else.
Shelley, I think if you overheard that conversation, you'd have a great answer, just kind of explaining all of the technological innovations that we use here on Earth every day. We're coming up to the end of the panel, so I'm going to let each of you leave us with some final lasting words. And Jeremy, I will let you start us off. When it comes to Web3 and space, what do you hope that our audience takes away from this conversation?
Space is hard. It is. We live in this era of exploration and we see these great things, but it's very, very, very hard, right? It is the hardest thing that we've ever done as a species, or one of them. And the proof is this. From the first winged flight from the Wright brothers until the end of the 1920s, we went from no airplanes in the sky to businesses predicated on the existence of airplanes. Sputnik was in 1958. And here we are. It's, 50 plus years later, 60 years later, and space as an industry is still nascent. That tells you how hard it is.
And Shelley, through your lens, when you're thinking about augmented and mixed reality, what do you hope our audience leaves this conversation thinking about when it comes to Web3 and space?
Oh, I often point to a picture of the Curiosity rover, and I'll tell my groups to, follow your curiosities, and tomorrow will be closer than you think. If we all stay curious and exploring and pursuing those curiosities, we make advancements. And I think that Web3 and the capabilities with Web3 fit that theme.
That's wonderful. This was the most compelling conversation I have had all day. So I want to thank both of you for joining me and entertaining my questions about Hollywood and why we even need to be thinking about space. It was absolutely wonderful. And just by looking at the comments, I know that our audience took a lot away from it. So thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And our next two chats coming up, I'm not exactly sure what they are because I don't have them on my screen anymore, but they do have to do with blockchain and crypto. I do remember that. So Nikki will let you guys know in the chat what's coming up. And thank you all for being so attentive.